The mist rolls slowly across the hills, swallowing stone towers that have stood for centuries. Beneath those walls, whispers linger of quiet betrayals, of choices made in candlelit rooms, and of truths carefully buried beneath generations of pride. From a distance, it appears untouched, almost eternal, but within, something far less perfect took root. In the years following the Norman Conquest of England, power was not inherited, was taken, secured, and defended at any cost. Titles could be granted in a moment and stripped away just as quickly. Loyalty was rewarded until it became inconvenient. And somewhere along this shifting ground, a family rose ambitious, calculated, and determined to secure its place among the ruling elite. Yet their greatest strength would also become their quiet burden. Behind grand halls and lavish feasts, there were decisions no one spoke of, alliances forged not out of trust, but necessity, and one choice made to preserve everything they had built would leave a mark that no title, no castle, and no legacy could ever fully erase. Some dynasties are remembered for their power, but this one is remembered for what it tried to hide. Asterisk, the story of the Manners family does not begin with certainty, but with fragments names scattered through records, loyalties shifting beneath the weight of conquest, and a land still learning to accept its new rulers. In the years after 1066, England was no longer simply inherited. It was reorganized, claimed, and divided among those who had proven their loyalty on the battlefield. Power belonged to those who stood closest to the crown, and survival depended on knowing when to stand firm and when to yield. Belvoir Castle itself traces its earliest foundations to this turbulent period, first established by Robert de Todeni, a Norman noble granted land for his service to William the Conqueror. The castle rose not as a symbol of beauty, but of control, a fortress designed to oversee the vale below, reminding all who passed that authority had changed hands. Generations passed, and ownership shifted, until the lands would eventually fall into the hands of a family whose name would become inseparable from its legacy. By the late 15th century, the Manners family began to emerge from relative obscurity. Their ascent was neither immediate nor guaranteed. Unlike some noble houses, they did not inherit unquestioned power. Instead, they moved carefully through service, loyalty, and strategic alliances, building a reputation that could withstand the uncertainties of the Tudor court. It was a time when favor could be won through devotion, but just as easily lost through suspicion. Thomas Manners, born in 1488, would become the figure through whom the family's fortunes began to transform. Raised in a world where ambition was both necessary and dangerous, he learned early that proximity to the crown was a double-edged sword. To rise too quickly invited envy. To hesitate risked irre. His environment demanded not only intelligence, but restraint. Yet beneath this careful rise lay a quiet tension. The Manners family understood that their position was not secured by birth alone, but by continued approval. Every alliance, every decision, carried weight, and though their ambitions were clear, so too was an unspoken fear that Aberdeen, though a building could be taken away just as swiftly as it had been granted. In these early years, their story was not one of dominance, but of survival, and it was within that delicate balance between loyalty and self-preservation that the foundations of their future power and their future burdens were quietly laid. Asterisk, by the early years of the 16th century, the Manners family had reached a quiet but decisive turning point. They were no longer simply surviving within the shifting currents of noble life. They were beginning to understand how to shape them. At the center of this transformation stood Thomas Manners, a man whose ambition was carefully measured, and whose greatest strength lay not in bold defiance, but in calculated loyalty. The Tudor court, under King Henry VIII, was a place of splendor and danger in equal measure. Favor could elevate a family to remarkable heights, but it demanded constant demonstration of loyalty. Thomas recognized this with unusual clarity. Rather than challenge the system or seek rapid advancement, he chose a steadier path, aligning himself closely with the crown, supporting royal decisions, and ensuring that his name became associated with reliability rather than risk. This approach began to yield results. Thomas Manners gained increasing recognition at court, not through dramatic acts, but through consistency. His presence became familiar, his counsel trusted, and his loyalty noted. In 1525, this careful positioning culminated in a defining moment. He was granted the title of the first Earl of Rutland. It was not merely a reward, but a signal. The Manners family had moved from the edges of noble society into its recognized ranks. Yet, this rise was not without its compromises. The court of Henry VIII was marked by religious upheaval, shifting alliances, and decisions that often carried moral consequences. Thomas supported the crown through these changes, even as England moved away from the authority of Rome. Such loyalty ensured his continued favor, but it also meant standing beside choices that divided the nation and reshaped its identity. Strategic marriages further strengthened the family's position. Alliances were formed, not for affection, but for stability, binding the Manners' name to other influential houses and securing their place within the aristocratic network. Each connection expanded their influence, but also tied them more deeply into a system where reputation mattered above all else. Recognition brought opportunity, but it also brought scrutiny. The Manners family now occupied a visible position, one that required constant maintenance. Their success depended not only on past loyalty, but on their ability to remain indispensable. There was little room for error, and even less for independence. Beneath the surface of this growing success lay a quiet understanding. Their rise had not been built on power alone, but on alignment, on knowing when to support, when to remain silent, and when to act in ways that preserved favor. It was a strategy that brought them into the inner circles of influence, but it also placed them within a system that could demand more than they were ever prepared to give. And though the title of Earl of Rutland marked the beginning of their recognized power, it also marked the beginning of a deeper dependence, one that would, in time, reveal the true cost of their success. Asterisk, with the title of Earl of Rutland secured in 1525, the Manners family entered a new phase, one defined not by cautious advancement, but by deliberate expansion. Their position was no longer fragile in the way it had once been, yet it remained dependent on something far less stable than inheritance. Perception. Power, they had learned, was not simply held, it had to be displayed, reinforced, and continuously justified. Belvoir Castle became central to this transformation. What had once stood as a defensive stronghold began to evolve into something far more symbolic. Its towers and halls were no longer meant solely to protect, but to impress, to communicate wealth, influence, and permanence. As the family's status grew, so too did the scale of their estate. Renovations and expansions were carried out not merely for comfort, but as statements of authority. Every stone, every chamber, served as a reminder that the Manners' name now carried weight within the highest circles of English society. Their integration into elite society followed naturally. Invitations to court became more frequent, and their presence at royal events more expected. They were no longer observers of power, they were participants within it. Relationships with other noble families deepened, often reinforced through carefully arranged marriages that ensured alliances remained strong. These unions were not simply personal, they were strategic, binding the Manners family to networks of influence that extended far beyond their own lands. Yet entry into this world required adaptation. The expectations of aristocratic life were exacting. Appearance, conduct, and reputation had to be maintained with precision. The Manners family embraced these demands, cultivating an image of stability and refinement. They hosted gatherings that reflected their elevated status, welcomed influential figures into their halls, and positioned themselves as both loyal subjects and capable leaders. In doing so, they secured not only recognition, but acceptance. Asterisk, their influence extended beyond social circles. As members of the aristocracy, they played roles within political life, contributing to decisions that shaped the direction of the country. Their voice, once absent from such matters, now carried significance. Land ownership brought responsibility, and with it, authority over those who lived and worked within their domain. The family's reach grew wider, touching both the highest levels of society and the daily lives of those beneath them. But with expansion came a subtle shift, one that was not immediately recognized. Success, once hard-earned and carefully protected, began to feel expected. The discipline that had defined their rise softened, replaced by a growing confidence in their place within the established order. Pride, though never openly acknowledged, began to influence their decisions. The need to maintain their status encouraged choices that prioritized appearance over authenticity. Belvoir Castle, in all its grandeur, became both a symbol of their achievement and a quiet burden. Its upkeep required resources. Its image demanded perfection, and its presence reinforced the expectation that the family must always appear strong, united, and prosperous. Within its walls, moments of doubt or disagreement could not be allowed to surface beyond private spaces. Reputation had become as important as reality. This tension between what was shown and what was felt began to take root within the family itself. Each generation inherited not only wealth and title, but the responsibility to preserve an image that allowed little room for vulnerability. Decisions were made with the understanding that any sign of weakness could threaten the position they had worked so hard to secure. And yet, beneath the carefully constructed facade, small fractures began to form. Differences in opinion, pressures of expectation, and the weight of maintaining their legacy created strains that were not always visible, but deeply felt. These were not dramatic conflicts, but quiet ones. Conversations left unfinished doubts, left unspoken compromises accepted without question. The Manners family had achieved what they set out to do. They had risen from uncertainty into influence, from obscurity into recognition. They had secured their place among England's most powerful families, built a home that reflected their success, and established connections that extended across the highest levels of society. But in doing so, they had also entered a world where stability was never guaranteed, where favor could shift, and where the cost of maintaining power could grow heavier with each passing generation. Their expansion had brought them everything they had sought, but it had also bound them to a system that would demand constant vigilance, and, in time, difficult choices. The castle stood as proof of their success, yet within its walls, the first signs of something more complicated, something less certain, had already begun to emerge. By the early 17th century, the world the Manners family had carefully learned to navigate began to shift once more. The stability they had come to rely upon, built through loyalty, alliances, and reputation, was quietly eroding beneath larger forces beyond their control. England itself stood on uncertain ground, as tensions between the monarchy and parliament deepened, creating divisions that would soon reach into even the most established noble houses. At first, the conflict did not appear as a direct threat. It arrived gradually, through conversations that carried a sharper edge, through expectations that were no longer aligned, and through a growing sense that neutrality would not remain an option. The Manners family, like many of their standing, found themselves caught between competing loyalties. Their history had been shaped by service to the crown, yet the changing political climate demanded a careful reconsideration of where that loyalty should now lie. Within the family, this caution did not produce immediate agreement. Some saw continued allegiance to the monarchy as both a duty and a necessity, an extension of the very strategy that had secured their rise. Others recognized the risks of tying themselves too closely to a system that appeared increasingly unstable. These differences were not openly hostile, but they introduced a tension that had not previously existed. For the first time, unity within the family was not assumed. Externally, rivalries began to take clearer form. Other aristocratic families, facing the same uncertainties, made their own choices, aligning themselves with either royal authority or parliamentary power. These decisions were observed, remembered, and judged. Influence was no longer measured solely by status, but by position within a growing divide. Every alliance carried new meaning, and every hesitation invited scrutiny. Encounters that might once have been cordial took on a different tone. Conversations became cautious, layered with implication rather than clarity. Trust, once extended through shared status, became conditional. Even long-standing relationships were affected. As political differences introduced distance where there had once been familiarity. For the Manners family, the conflict was not yet a battle fought on fields, but one experienced within Room Street. Decisions that could not be undone, and through choices that would define how they were seen by both allies and rivals. Their position, once secured through careful balance, now required something more decisive. And though the first signs of rivalry appeared subtle, they carried with them a deeper consequence. The question was no longer simply how to maintain power but how to choose between competing visions of loyalty, each with its own risks. In making that choice, the Manners family would not only shape their future, but also begin a process that would quietly alter the very foundation of who they believed themselves to be. Asterisk, as the 1640s approached, the fragile balance that had once defined English noble life gave way to open division. What had begun as quiet disagreement between the Crown and Parliament evolved into a conflict that demanded clear allegiance. By 1642, the English Civil War had begun, and neutrality, once a careful strategy, was no longer sustainable. For the Manners family, the moment they had hoped to delay had finally arrived. Their history inclined them towards the royalist cause. Loyalty to the monarchy had shaped their rise, and turning away from it risked not only reputation, but identity. Yet the decision was not as simple as tradition might suggest. The war was not merely political, it was deeply personal, affecting estates, livelihoods, and the safety of entire households. Aligning with the king meant embracing uncertainty. As parliamentes, influence grew stronger in certain regions. Within the family, these tensions intensified. Discussions that had once been measured became more urgent, more divided. Some members believed that standing with the crown was an obligation, regardless of the outcome. Others questioned whether loyalty should come at such a high cost, particularly when the future of the monarchy itself seemed uncertain. These were not disagreements that could be easily resolved. They lingered, creating distance where there had once been shared purpose. Externally, the consequences of these choices became increasingly visible. Aristocratic families who had once gathered in the same halls now found themselves on opposing sides of a widening conflict. Relationships fractured, and rivalries hardened into open hostility. Land, influence, and survival were all at stake. The Manners family, once defined by their ability to navigate shifting alliances, now faced a situation where every decision carried immediate and lasting consequences. Publicly, allegiance became a matter of reputation. To support the crown was to risk association with a declining authority in certain areas. While aligning with Parliament could be seen as a betrayal of long-held loyalties, there was no path that preserved both honor and security. Each choice demanded sacrifice, and each sacrifice altered how the family was perceived. Belvoir Castle itself became more than a residence. It stood as a symbol of where the family's loyalties lay. Its presence, once a sign of stability and influence, now drew attention. In times of conflict, visibility could invite danger. The estate, with all its history and significance, was no longer simply a home. It was a position, a statement, and potentially a target. Emotionally, the strain began to take its toll. Trust, once assumed within the family, became more fragile. Differences in belief created quiet divisions, not always spoken aloud, but deeply felt. The weight of expectations to uphold their name, their alliances, and their chosen side pressed heavily upon each decision. The escalation of tension did not come in a single moment, but through a series of choices that narrowed the possibilities before them. With each step, the Manners family moved further away from the balanced position that had once ensured their survival. The strategy that had served them so well, careful alignment without full commitment, could no longer be maintained. By the time the conflict reached its height, the question was no longer whether they would be affected, but how deeply. Their loyalties had been declared, their position made visible, and their relationships reshaped by the pressures of war. What had once been a matter of influence and reputation had become something far more immediate. And as the tension continued to build, it became clear that the consequences would not be limited to the battlefield. The true cost would be felt within the family itself, altering bonds, redefining trust, and leaving marks that would not easily fade. When the English Civil War came to an end in 1651, it did not bring the sense of resolution many had expected. Instead, it left behind a fractured society, one where loyalties had been exposed, reputations redefined, and the meaning of power itself had begun to change. For the Manners family, the years that followed were not simply about recovery, but about reinvention. The execution of King Charles I in 1649 had sent a shock through the aristocracy. For families whose identity had been built upon loyalty to the crown, it was more than a political loss. It was a disruption of the very foundation upon which their status had rested. The Manners family, having aligned themselves with royal authority, now faced a difficult reality. Their past loyalties, once a source of strength, had become a potential liability. During the period of the Commonwealth, power shifted towards Parliament and its supporters. Families associated with the royalist cause found themselves navigating a landscape where their influence was diminished and their positions uncertain. For the Manners family, this meant adapting without openly abandoning the identity that had defined them. It required a careful balance, one that allowed them to maintain their dignity while avoiding further risk. Belvoir Castle, which had once stood as a symbol of confidence and permanence, now carried a more complicated meaning. It remained an impressive estate, but its presence alone could not guarantee security. The family had to reconsider how they presented themselves, both publicly and privately. Grandeur, once an unquestioned expression of status, had to be tempered with caution. Then, in 1660, the restoration of the monarchy under King Charles II altered the course of their story once again. For the Manners family, this moment offered an opportunity to reclaim the standing they had feared losing. Their previous loyalty to the crown, which had seemed uncertain during the Commonwealth, now worked in their favor. Recognition returned, and with it, a renewed sense of belonging within the aristocratic order. Yet this return was not without complication. The years of conflict had changed the social landscape. Acceptance was no longer based solely on lineage or past service. It required demonstration, performance, and the careful management of perception. The Manners family understood this, and they embraced the role expected of them. Belvoir Castle once again became a center of social life. Gatherings were hosted with renewed confidence, inviting members of the aristocracy to experience the refinement and stability the family sought to project. These events were more than social occasions. They were carefully constructed displays of legitimacy. Every detail, from the arrangement of rooms to the composition of guest lists, served to reinforce the idea that the Manners family remained firmly within the ranks of England's elite. Publicly, this strategy proved effective. Their presence was acknowledged, their influence gradually restored, and their name continued to carry weight. They had navigated one of the most turbulent periods in English history and emerged with their status intact. But beneath this carefully maintained image, the effects of the past had not fully faded. The divisions that had formed during the years of conflict did not disappear simply because the monarchy had been restored. Within the family, differences in belief and experience lingered. Some members had carried the cost of loyalty more heavily than others, and those experiences shaped how they viewed both power and trust. This created a quiet tension, one that was not visible in public, but present in private moments. Conversations were more measured, decisions more cautious. The certainty that had once guided the family's actions had been replaced by an awareness of how quickly circumstances could change. Their acceptance within society, though real, was not entirely secure. It depended on their continued ability to meet expectations, to present unity, and to avoid the missteps that could once again place them at risk. At the same time, competition among noble families intensified. The restoration of the monarchy reopened pathways to influence, and many sought to strengthen their positions. The Manners family found themselves not only reclaiming their status, but defending it against others who were equally determined to rise. Social acceptance was no longer a fixed achievement. It was an ongoing effort. This battle for status was fought not through open conflict, but through presence, reputation, and influence. It was seen in the alliances they formed, the events they hosted, and the roles they played within the court. Success required constant attention, and failure could come from something as subtle as a perceived weakness or a misjudged association. Emotionally, this environment demanded resilience. The Manners family had to reconcile their public image of stability with the private understanding that their position remained conditional. They had regained their place, but at the cost of a deeper awareness, one that could not be undone. Power, they had learned, was not permanent. It could shift, disappear, and return in forms that required adaptation. In this way, their acceptance into society after the turmoil of war was both a victory and a burden. They had proven their ability to endure, to adjust, and to reclaim their influence. Yet the process had changed them. The confidence that once came from steady advancement had been replaced by a more cautious understanding of their world. The Manners family stood once again among England's elite, their castle restored as a center of influence, their name respected within noble circles. But beneath that success lay a quieter truth that their place was no longer defined solely by who they were, but by how well they could continue to maintain the image they had fought so hard to preserve. Asterisk by the late 18th century, T. Manners family once again stood at a critical point in their history. Their position within the aristocracy remained secure in appearance, yet beneath that stability, pressures had begun to gather slowly at first, then with increasing weight. The world around them was changing. Wealth, once rooted primarily in land and title, was being reshaped by new economic forces, shifting expectations, and the rising influence of industry. The foundations upon which their power had been built were no longer as certain as they once had seemed. Belvoir Castle, the centerpiece of their identity, reflected both their strength and their vulnerability. It had been rebuilt and refined across generations, each transformation reinforcing the family's presence within the highest ranks of society. Yet its grandeur came at a cost: maintenance, expansion, and the expectations associated with such. A residence required substantial resources. What had once symbolized success now demanded constant investment, binding the family more tightly to the need to sustain their image. The early 19th century brought this tension into sharper focus. In 1816, a devastating fire broke out, destroying much of Belvoir Castle. The loss was immediate and profound. Beyond the physical damage, it struck at the heart of what the castle represented. It was not simply a structure, it was the embodiment of their legacy, their authority, and their place within the aristocracy. Its destruction forced a decision that could not be avoided. The question was not whether to rebuild, but how. For John Henry Manners, the 5th Duke of Rutland, the responsibility was both practical and symbolic. Rebuilding the castle offered an opportunity to restore what had been lost, but it also required confronting the realities of their situation. The cost would be immense, and the decision would shape the future of the family for generations. To rebuild on a grand scale would reaffirm their status, demonstrating resilience and continuity. To rebuild modestly, or not at all, would signal a retreat and acknowledgement that their power was no longer what it at on Sabine. Discussions within the family reflected the weight of this choice. Some viewed the fire as a moment to reconsider, to adapt to changing circumstances and preserve resources. Others saw it as a challenge to be met with strength, a chance to prove that their legacy remained unbroken. These differing perspectives did not erupt into open conflict, but they revealed a deeper uncertainty about the path forward. Externally, expectations added further pressure. The aristocracy watched closely. How the Manners family responded would influence not only their own reputation, but how they were perceived within a society that still valued continuity and grandeur. Belvoir Castle had long been a symbol of their place among England's elite, and its future would either reinforce or weaken that perception. As plans began to take shape, it became clear that this was more than a rebuilding project. It was a defining moment, one that would determine whether the Manners family could maintain the image they had spent centuries constructing, or whether they would begin to acknowledge the limits of their power. The stage was set, the loss had occurred, the stakes were understood, and the decision ahead carried consequences that could not be easily undone. Asterisk. The decision to rebuild Belvoir Castle did not arrive in a single moment. It emerged slowly, shaped by competing voices, unspoken fears, and the weight of expectation that had followed the manor's family for generations. What appeared from the outside to be a question of architecture was, in truth, a confrontation with something far deeper: their identity, their pride, and their willingness to face a changing world. John Henry Manners, the 5th Duke of Rutland, stood at the center of this conflict. The fire of 1816 had taken more than stone and timber. It had exposed a vulnerability that could no longer be ignored. The castle had always symbolized permanence, yet its destruction revealed how fragile that permanence truly was. Rewielded, it was not simply an act of restoration, it was a declaration. Within private discussions, the divisions became clearer. Some members of the family urged caution. They recognized the financial strain that such an undertaking would bring, particularly at a time when traditional sources of income were becoming less reliable. Land revenues no longer carried the same certainty, and the broader economic shifts of the period made large expenditures increasingly risky. For them, the fire presented an opportunity to adapt, to reshape their legacy in a way that aligned with the realities of a changing society. Others saw the matter differently. To rebuild Belvoir Castle on anything less than its former scale would be to accept decline. It would signal weakness, not only to other noble families, but to themselves. The manor's name had been built upon continuity, resilience, and visible strength. To retreat from that image would be to undermine everything they had worked to establish. In Terbu, the only acceptable response was to rebuild not just as it had been, but in a way that reinforced their place at the center of aristocratic life. The Duke himself carried the burden of choosing between these perspectives. His position required him to balance practicality with expectation, to consider both the future of the family and the legacy he had inherited. Yet this was not a decision that could satisfy all sides. To prioritize caution risked diminishing their status. To pursue grandeur risked placing the family under lasting financial strain. As plans progressed, it became evident which path would be taken. The decision was made to rebuild Belvoir Castle on a grand scale, embracing architectural ambition and aesthetic refinement. The design would not merely restore what had been lost, it would elevate it, creating a structure that reflected both history and aspiration. It was a choice that aligned with tradition, reaffirming their identity as a family that endured through strength and visibility. Publicly, the decision was received as a sign of resilience. The rebuilding effort demonstrated that the manor's family remained committed to their legacy, unwilling to allow adversity to define them. It reinforced their image as one of the enduring pillars of the aristocracy, capable of overcoming loss with determination. Privately, however, the implications were more complex. The financial demands of the project were significant, requiring resources that extended beyond immediate means. The choice to rebuild had secured their image, but it had also bound them more tightly to the very system that had begun to shift beneath them. The pressure to maintain appearances, already present, became even more pronounced. This confrontation between caution and pride, between adaptation and tradition, did not end with the decision itself. It marked a turning point. The manor's family chose to preserve their identity in its most visible form, even as the world around them continued to change. In choosing to rebuild, they reaffirmed who they were, but they also set in motion consequences that would extend far beyond the walls of the castle. Consequences that would shape not only their future, but the true cost of the legacy they had chosen to protect. The rebuilding of Belvoir Castle was completed not as a quiet restoration, but as a statement, one that echoed across the aristocratic world of early 19th century Britain, rising once again above the veil. Its renewed form reflected both the strength of the manor's family and their determination to remain visible, relevant, and respected. From the outside, it appeared as a triumph over loss, a powerful reminder that their legacy had endured. Yet beneath this visible success, the consequences of that decision began to unfold in ways far less immediate, but far more lasting. The financial burden of reconstruction was substantial. The scale and ambition of the project required resources that extended beyond the comfortable limits the family had once known. Funds were drawn from estates, revenues were stretched, and the margin for error became increasingly narrow. While the castle stood as proof of resilience, it also represented a commitment that would shape the family's financial reality for years to come. In the short term, the decision achieved its intended effect. The Manos family retained their standing within aristocratic society. Their ability to rebuild on such a grand scale reinforced the perception that they remained among England's most influential noble houses. Invitations continued, alliances were maintained, and their presence within elite circles remained secure. The image they had worked so hard to preserve had not only survived it, had been strengthened. But this stability was, in many ways, constructed. It depended on continued performance, on the ability to sustain an image that required constant reinforcement. The rebuilt Belvoir Castle demanded upkeep, not only in its physical form, but in what it represented. Every gathering, every display of hospitality, every public appearance became part of an ongoing effort to justify the scale of their decision. Over time, the pressure to maintain this standard began to reveal its effects. The family found themselves increasingly tied to the expectations that accompanied their position. The freedom to adapt, to reduce, to simplify, or to reconsider became more limited. Their legacy, once a source of strength, had become a structure that constrained as much as it supported. Internally, the impact was more subtle, but no less significant. The decision to rebuild had resolved the immediate question of how to respond to loss, but it had not eliminated the underlying tensions that had shaped that choice. Those who had advocated caution were now faced with the reality of the path that had been taken. Those who had supported the project saw their vision realized, but at a cost that continued to unfold. These differences did not erupt into open conflict, yet they influenced how decisions were approached in the years that followed. A greater awareness of risk began to shape discussions. Even as the family remained committed to maintaining their established image, the confidence that had once guided their expansion was now tempered by experience. On a broader scale, the world around them continued to change. The rise of industrial wealth, the shifting structure of society, and the gradual redefinition of power meant that traditional aristocratic influence was no longer as dominant as it had once been. The Manos family, like many of their peers, found themselves adapting to a landscape where land and title alone were no longer sufficient to guarantee authority. Belvoir Castle, in this context, took on a new meaning. It remained a symbol of heritage and prestige, but it also stood as a reminder of a particular moment, a decision made to preserve the past in the face of an uncertain future. Its grandeur reflected continuity, yet it also highlighted the growing distance between tradition and change. The long-term impact of the rebuilding became clearer as generations passed. The financial commitments associated with the castle influenced how resources were managed, how estates were maintained, and how the family navigated the evolving expectations of society. The need to preserve what had been created shaped their choices, often limiting their ability to respond freely to new circumstances. Emotionally, the consequences were perhaps less visible, but deeply felt. The decision to rebuild had affirmed their identity, but it had also reinforced the idea that their worth was tied to what they could present to the world. The pressure to uphold that image did not disappear. It became part of the legacy itself. In this way, the aftermath of the fire and the decision that followed extended far beyond the immediate recovery. It influenced how the Manos family understood themselves, how they were perceived by others, and how they approached the challenges of a changing world. The castle stood complete, its towers and halls restored, its presence as commanding as ever. To those who saw it from a distance, it told a story of resilience, of strength, of a family that had overcome adversity without surrendering its place. But within that story lay another truth, one less visible, yet equally significant. The decision to rebuild had preserved their legacy, but it had also bound them more tightly to it. It had ensured that their past would continue to define their future, shaping not only what they could achieve, but what they would have to carry. And in that quiet balance between preservation and burden, true consequences of their choice began to take shape. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the Manners family entered a quieter phase of their long history, one less defined by visible conflict, yet shaped by a series of internal reckonings. The battles they now faced were no longer fought through alliances or public declarations, but through reflection, adaptation, and the gradual understanding that the world they had once mastered was changing in ways they could not fully control. The legacy they had preserved through centuries of careful decisions now stood before them in its full complexity. Belvoir Castle remained intact, its presence as commanding as ever, yet its meaning had evolved. It was no longer simply a symbol of power. It had become a responsibility, one that required continuous effort to sustain. The question was no longer how to build their legacy, but how to carry it forward without being overwhelmed by it. Within the family, this shift encouraged a more introspective approach. The confidence that had once driven expansion was replaced by a quieter awareness of limitation. Each generation inherited not only title and land, but the weight of expectations formed long before their time. Decisions were now shaped not only by ambition, but by the need to preserve what remained. These internal battles were subtle, often unspoken. They appeared in moments of hesitation, in discussions about how to manage estates, and in the careful balance between tradition and practicality. The desire to maintain continuity was strong, yet so too was the recognition that adaptation was necessary for survival. Finding that balance required a willingness to reconsider long-held assumptions, even as they sought to honor the past. Externally, the role of the aristocracy itself was undergoing transformation. Political influence, once a defining feature of noble life, had diminished. Power was shifting towards new institutions, new forms of wealth, and new ways of shaping society. For the Manners family, this meant redefining their place within a world that no longer operated by the same rules. Yet even as their influence changed, their identity remained closely tied to the traditions they had upheld. Public appearances continued. The castle remained a focal point of their presence, and their name retained its historical significance. They were no longer at the center of power, but they had not disappeared from it either. Instead, they occupied a space between past and present, carrying forward a legacy that still held meaning, even as its role evolved. Emotionally, this period was marked by a quiet acceptance. The certainty that had once guided their rise was gone, replaced by a more measured understanding of their position. The final battles they faced were not about gaining or defending power, but about defining what that power meant in a changing world. In this reflection, the Manners family began to recognize a truth that had been building over generations, that preserving a legacy required more than holding on to the past. It demanded an ability to adapt, to reassess, and to accept that some aspects of their identity would inevitably change. And in facing these quieter battles, they revealed a different kind of strength, one not rooted in expansion or dominance, but in endurance. Belvoir Castle stands today not merely as a residence, but as a carefully preserved monument, one that carries within its walls the layered history of the Manners family. Its towers, rebuilt after fire and shaped by centuries of ambition, rise above the landscape with a sense of permanence that seems almost untouched by time. Yet what it represents has evolved. It is no longer a fortress of power in the traditional sense, but a symbol of heritage, identity, and the endurance of a name that has adapted to survive. Every part of the castle reflects this transformation. The grand halls, once designed to host political discussions and reinforce authority, now serve as reminders of a past where influence was exercised through presence and perception. Portraits line the walls, each one capturing a moment in the family's history. Figures who contributed to its rise, who navigated its challenges, and who carried its legacy forward. Together, they create a narrative that is both continuous and incomplete, shaped as much by what is remembered as by what is left unspoken. The castle's architecture itself tells a story. Its reconstruction in the early 19th century was not only an act of restoration, but of reinvention. Designed to reflect both strength and refinement, it embodies the values the family sought to project: stability, elegance, and permanence. Yet this physical presence also carries the memory of the decision that brought it into being, a reminder of the moment when legacy was prioritized over caution. Beyond its walls, Belvoir Castle has taken on a broader cultural significance. It has become a site of public interest, drawing visitors who seek to experience a piece of England's aristocratic history. In opening parts of the estate to the public, the Manners family has adapted to the changing role of the aristocracy, transforming private heritage into shared experience. This shift reflects a wider recognition that survival now depends not only on preservation, but on engagement. Through this transformation, the castle functions as a bridge between past and present. It allows the family to maintain their connection to history while participating in a modern context where relevance is defined differently. Events, tours, and cultural activities bring new life to spaces that were once reserved for a select few, extending the meaning of the estate beyond its original purpose. Yet even as Belvoir Castle is presented to the public as a symbol of continuity and beauty, it retains a more private significance. For the Manners family, it remains a place where the weight of history is felt most directly. The rooms and corridors, unchanged in their structure, hold the memory of decisions, conflicts, and compromises that shaped their legacy. It is a space where the past is not distant, but present, where each generation is reminded of what has been built and what must be maintained. This dual identity, public monument and private inheritance, creates a quiet tension. Te. Presented to the world, emphasizes grandeur, stability, and tradition. It celebrates the achievements of the past and the endurance of the family name. But within that image lies a more complex reality, one that includes the costs associated with preserving such a legacy. Symbols, by their nature, simplify. They present a clear narrative, one that can be understood and admired. Belvoir Castle, as a symbol, reflects success, centuries of continuity, resilience in the face of change, and the ability to maintain identity across generations. Yet it also represents something less visible, the effort required to sustain that image, and the compromises made along the way. In this way, the castle stands as both an achievement and a reminder. It embodies the ambitions that drove the Manners family to rise, the decisions that allowed them to endure, and the adaptations that have kept their legacy relevant. At the same time, it reflects the ongoing responsibility that comes with such inheritance, the need to preserve not only the physical structure, but the meaning it carries as a monument. Belvoir Castle tells a story of continuity. As a symbol, it speaks of endurance. But as a lived space, it reveals something deeper: the ongoing relationship between past and present, between what is preserved and what must change. And within that balance, the true nature of the Manners family's legacy can be found not only in what has been built, but in how it continues to be carried forward. By the early 20th century, the position of families like the Manners had begun to shift in ways that could no longer be quietly managed or carefully avoided. The foundations of aristocratic powerland, ownership, inherited titles, and proximity to political authority were no longer sufficient to guarantee influence. Society itself was changing, shaped by industrial growth, expanding democracy, and the gradual redistribution of power away from traditional elites. For the Manners family, this transformation did not arrive as a single moment of loss, but as a gradual narrowing of what had once seemed certain. Their names still carried recognition, and Belvoir Castle remained an enduring presence. Yet the role they occupied within the broader structure of society was no longer the same. Influence that had once been exercised directly was now more symbolic, tied to history rather than immediate authority. Economic pressures played a significant role in this shift. The costs associated with maintaining large estates, particularly one as extensive and historically significant as Belvoir Castle, continued to grow. Agricultural revenues, once a stable source of income, became less reliable as the economy evolved. At the same time, new forms of wealth rooted in industry and commerce began to reshape the hierarchy of influence. The aristocracy, though still respected, was no longer at the center of economic power. In response, adaptation became necessary. The Manners family, like many of their contemporaries, explored ways to preserve their estate, while adjusting to new realities, opening parts of Belvoir Castle to the public. Hosting events and engaging with cultural initiatives allowed them to generate income while maintaining their connection to the property. These changes marked a shift from private authority to public engagement, redefining what it meant to hold such a legacy. This adaptation, however, came with its own implications. The transformation of the estate into a space that could be shared altered its meaning. What had once been exclusively private reserved for the family and their immediate circle became accessible to others. While this ensured the preservation of the castle, it also required a reimagining of its role. The boundaries between personal history and public presentation became less distinct emotionally. This period carried a sense of quiet adjustment. The loss experienced by the Manor's family was not dramatic, but it was undeniable. The certainty that had once defined their place in society was replaced by a more fluid understanding of their position. They were no longer the central figures within the structure of power, but they remained connected to it through history, tradition, and the enduring presence of their estate. This shift required a different kind of resilience. Where earlier generations had focused on expansion and consolidation, the challenge now lay in preservation and relevance. The family's ability to endure depended not on reclaiming past forms of power, but on recognizing how those forms had changed. Their survival was not measured by dominance, but by continuity. Despite these changes, the Manor's name did not fade. It remained associated with a legacy that had been carefully built and maintained over centuries. Belvoir Castle continued to stand as a visible reminder of that legacy, its presence bridging the gap between past and present. The family's story, though altered, did not end, it evolved. In this way, the decline experienced by the Manor's family was not a complete loss, but a transformation. They moved from a position of direct authority to one of historical significance, from active influence to enduring presence. What they lost in immediate power, they retained in continuity. Yet this outcome carried a quiet truth. The world they had once helped shape no longer existed in the same form. Their legacy remained, but it existed within a new context, one that required acceptance as much as adaptation. And in that acceptance, the final shape of their story emerged not as a fall, marked by disappearance, but as a gradual transition into something quieter, yet still enduring. The story of the Manor's family is not one defined by a single rise or a single fall, but by a long unfolding balance between ambition and consequence. From their early emergence in the uncertain years after the Norman Conquest to their place within the shifting structure of modern society, their journey reflects how power is gained, sustained, and eventually transformed. They rose through careful loyalty, aligning themselves with authority at moments when such choices carried both opportunity and risk. Their success was not accidental. It was built through discipline, strategic decisions, and an understanding of how to navigate a world where favor could determine survival. Belvoir Castle became the physical expression of that success, standing as a symbol of everything they had achieved. Yet what they gained came at a cost that was less visible, but no less real. In preserving their status, they tied themselves to expectations that allowed little room for change. The decision to rebuild, to maintain grandeur, and to uphold their image ensured continuity, but it also created a burden that each generation would inherit. Their power required constant reinforcement, and their identity became closely bound to how they were perceived. What endured is clear. The castle still stands. The name remains recognized. Their legacy continues to be part of England's historical landscape. But what was lost is more difficult to see. Certainty gave way to caution. Influence shifted into symbolism, and the freedom to define their own path was often shaped by the need to preserve what had already been built. In the end, the Manor's family did not disappear. Adapted, yet their story reveals a quiet truth that echoes across history. Power and permanence rarely exist without sacrifice. The legacy meant to last for centuries, but in doing so, they accepted a cost that could never be fully reclaimed.